Ruiz de Mendoza Ibanez. O professor Francisco Ruiz de Mendoza, como a maioria o conhece. O professor Mendoza, ele é professor de Linguística na Universidade de La Rioja, na Espanha. A sua especialidade é em cognição, ou melhor, em linguística cognitiva e funcional. Também trabalha com pragmática e com a gramática de construções. Já escreveu mais de 150 artigos em periódicos da área, coeditou 5 livros e é autor ou coautor nesses 5 livros. Ele tem sido convidado, ou foi convidado, desculpe, eu estou traduzindo em inglês, ele foi convidado como palestrante já mais de 100 vezes em eventos científicos em todo o mundo. Ele tem atuado como membro do corpo editorial de vários comitês de periódicos científicos da nossa área. Citando apenas alguns aqui, nós temos o periódico chamado Cognitive Linguistics, Língua. Ele tem também 3 livros, ele foi editor, né, em três séries de livros intitulados Review of Cognitive Linguistics, pela John Benjamins, e é coeditor do livro Applications of Cognitive Linguistics. Então, é um prazer estarmos hoje recebendo aqui o professor Francisco Ruiz de Mendoza, que vai nos falar sobre um tema muito interessante, que trata da metáfora e do símile. Especificamente, o título, se bem me recordo, é Constraints on Resemblance, Conceptual Metaphor and Simile Revisited. I could remember that by heart. Okay, Francisco, então, it's a pleasure for us to have you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pelosi. I feel very, very grateful and highly honored to be here with you, and your invitation is very kind. This is a nice experience, and I feel that I'm with friends with Professor Carneiro and Professor Pelosi. We have been working together in some projects, and I hope that we can keep this collaboration going on very active in the future. So the topic of the talk, as was announced, is constraints on resemblance. I'm going to talk about resemblance and how resemblance is manifested in metaphor and simile. And the idea is to review some of the concepts, maybe some, not misconceptions, but some weaknesses or some gaps that there is in the state of the art in the field. And I will try to fill those gaps and make metaphor and simile part of an encompassing model of meaning construction. So the context and the starting point is conceptual metaphor theory, and I suppose that the members of the audience are already acquainted with the basics of conceptual metaphor theory. That was studied by Lakoff and Johnson in the 1980s, and it has become one of the main points of research in cognitive linguistics nowadays. In conceptual metaphor theory, the understanding of metaphor is slightly different from what was before Lakoff and Johnson wrote Metaphors We Live By in 1980. They, instead of talking about metaphor in terms of rhetoric or in terms of communicative impact, as was the case in, for example, in pragmatics, they decided to approach metaphor from the point of view of what happens in the mind. And they assumed that it was possible to describe metaphor as a system of correspondences, where we use one set of items, which they called, of conceptual items, which they call the conceptual domain, to reason and talk about another set of conceptual items that they called the target domain. the correspondences between source and target were labeled a mapping, a term that was borrowed, of course, from mathematics. The reasoning process behind metaphor was one of similarity, and that was the type of metaphor that had been explored over and over again in rhetoric and in literary theory. And they added, more important than similarity is probably experiential correlation. Experiential correlation meaning the frequent co-occurrence of events. To give you a couple of examples of how similarity metaphors and experiential correlation metaphors work, you have on the screen a couple of them. The first one is the connection between teeth and pearls. Teeth and pearls are both small, white, bright. So the connection is one of resemblance between the two items. The pearls is the source domain, and the teeth is the target domain. We think and talk about the teeth in terms of the pearls. Then, as an example of experiential correlation, we can have the metaphor more is up and the complementary metaphor less is down, as in prices are going up or going down. Lakoff and Johnson argued from the very beginning that these metaphors were deeply ingrained in the brain because they came along with our experience of the world. So, for example, when we see levels of a substance rise or fall, at the same time, we understand, we have an experience of perceiving an increase in their quantity. If they go down, there is a decrease in their quantity, which means that height and quantity correlate in our experience. The same happens if you, for example, put one book on top of the other, forming a pile. If you pile up books, the greater the amount of books, the higher the pile. So there is a correlation between quantity and height, and that is what allows us to think of more, which is quantity, in terms of up, or less in terms of down, as in prices are going up and going down. You have an example of similarity, a graphic example of similarity. The teeth are like pearls. And for experiential correlation, we have this classical example of someone pouring water into a glass. As the level of the water goes up, the amount of water also increases. Of course, there is no similarity between height and quantity. The only connection that we can find is based on how we correlate experiences in our everyday living. Initially, conceptual metaphor theory became obsessed with exponential correlation. It was like the new toy. They found that there was so much of our thinking processes that were based on correlation metaphors that they became the focus of most research. And cross-domain similarity was abandoned. These cognitive linguists understood that most of the focus for centuries have been on similarity. So it was necessary to redress the balance between similarity and exponential correlation, which basically means that they forgot about cross-domain similarity. Joseph Grady, one of George Lakoff's collaborators, wrote a very interesting paper in 1999 that I think was published in the journal Cognitive Linguistics, where he said, okay, we have been doing this for quite some time. What if we redress the balance again, and now we try to strike a real balance between emphasis on correlation and emphasis on similarity? The interesting thing about this proposal of redressing the balance in the amount of research devoted to both phenomena is that maybe nobody paid much attention to him, and similarity metaphor was basically ignored. Now, are there exceptions? There are a few exceptions. One of them that is was published in the Review of Cognitive Linguistics in 2015 is by Manuela Romano. She's a professor of cognitive linguistics in Madrid. And she investigated simile in connection with the notion of resemblance, gathering a lot of information from psychology, psycholinguistic research mainly, and she took a discourse analysis perspective. But she didn't go in great detail into the connection between resemblance and experiential correlation, and she didn't devote much attention. She didn't pay much attention to other problems that arise when we try to look at simile from a broader perspective. And I think that's what I want to do. So my proposal is to investigate resemblance first, and then how resemblance is made manifest in language in a number of ways. I have identified a few ways, and that's what I will try to talk about. So first of all, resemblance is not an absolute concept. We need to keep that in mind. Resemblance is assessed by individuals in terms of degrees. This is similar to A is similar to B, or A is more similar to B than C, for example. That's why we have comparative formulations in language. Then resemblance can be quite abstract. We are always thinking of resemblance as the example of the teeth and the pearls. That's attribute-based resemblance, but we have other forms of resemblance that are more abstract. We're going to go into that too. And then I think we can make a distinction between non-structural and structural resemblance. Structural resemblance underlies analogical thinking. In the literature on analogy, there is quite a mess on what analogy really means, and there are very many proposals. And I think I can give some insight that might rationalize the approach to analogy. Some linguists think that all metaphors are based on analogy, and that is not correct. There is no analogy between the teeth and the pearls. There are attributes in common, but there is not analogical thought. And finally, I will try to, if I have time, I will try to talk about effect-cause connections and how they can affect similarity judgments. So first, these are the dichotomies that I'm handling. The distinction between non-structural resemblance and structural resemblance on the one hand, and on the other hand, the distinction between low-level resemblance and high-level resemblance. You will see that in a minute. Low-level attribute-based resemblance, which is the same as non-analogical metaphor and simile. Please think of the following. Think of the examples that are in the middle of the screen. My job is a jail, and my job is like a jail. And if you have a feeling like native English speakers about how frequent one expression or the other would be, you would probably feel that my job is a jail makes a lot more sense than my job is like a jail. Probably because there are some reasons of communicative impact behind the selection of my job is a jail, with preference to my job is like a jail. And we can wonder, why that? So I have been told all my life when we handle metaphor and simile, that simile is simply another way of expressing similarity like metaphor, and that metaphors can be converted into similes and the other way around. Well, that is not exactly the case. Even though we have the possibility to convert from a formal perspective a metaphor into a simile, that doesn't mean by any means that the meaning impact of metaphor and simile is the same. Let's go into that. I'm going to handle open-endedness, then class inclusion, and similarity constraints. So we begin with open-endedness, and we take a distinction between open-ended and close-ended similarity judgments. In the example, your eyes are as blue as the ocean, you will realize that there is only one feature at stake, which is blue. There is only a limited number of explicit source domain attributes that are selected to be mapped onto the target. The eyes is the target, the ocean is the source, and the feature that is at work is blue. But we can have, that's the as comparative formulation. But we can have something which is a little bit more open. For example, we can say your eyes are like the ocean, or you have ocean-like eyes. In principle, there is no limit to the number of attributes that can be selected from the source, the ocean, to be mapped onto the target, the eyes. And that's very interesting. So in what sense are your eyes like the ocean? Maybe they are deep, maybe they are clear, maybe they are watery, maybe there are other features. Maybe when you look at the person's eyes, you see like tiny little sparks in them, and it's the same as the reflection of light on the surface of the water. So you can start exploring different possibilities, and you may come up with a number of different interpretive solutions. So in principle, in theory, there is no limit other than, of course, the number of attributes that both the source and the target have. Of course, we can narrow down the scope of open-ended simile, and there is a way to do that. You have an example at the bottom of the screen. He stood smiling at the door like a proud father at a wedding reception. Instead of saying he stood smiling at the door like a proud father, there is more elaboration, like a proud father at a wedding reception. And of course, we could even extend this more and narrow down the open-endedness of like similes. So there are formal ways, there are explicit ways to make the connection between the source and the target narrower than what is generally the case with like similes. What about metaphor? Is metaphor open-ended like these like similes, or is it close-ended like as comparative formulations? Well, it depends. Metaphor is more inclined to conventionalization than simile. Of course, we have idiomatics that are based on simile, but in general, for every conventional metaphor, if we use the like formula, the like formulation, the conventionalization will vanish. So if I say my boss is a fox, everyone understands that my boss is a cunning person. It would be very close to saying my boss is as cunning as a fox, but that's because the English language has conventionalized the meaning of fox as a cunning person. But what about non-conventional metaphors? Do we have them? Yes. Go back again to the eyes and the ocean. That's not a conventional formulation. It may refer to the color of the eyes, of course, but to other features of oceans too, like the depth of the water and the crystalline nature. But what experimental psychologists have found, like for example Glocksberg, is that when people use your eyes are the ocean and your eyes are like the ocean, the tendency is to open interpretation up intuitively more for the like configuration. So the number of features that people associate with your eyes are like the ocean is more limited than for your eyes are like the ocean. This is a very interesting phenomenon. It has not been explained by linguists, and I think that we do have an explanation for this phenomenon. Why are like connections open-ended to a larger extent than metaphorical conventions when the metaphor is not conventional? You have an explanation here on the slide. It is iconic discontiguity or iconic distance. That is, like separates or dissociates the source and the target domains, making the expression more open than the metaphor. When you say your eyes are the ocean, the eyes on the ocean are formally closer than when you say your eyes are like the ocean. So this would be simply a case of what linguists call iconicity in language. And the greater the distance between two terms in any expression, the greater the discontinuity. And therefore, they are felt as open to be explored in a broader number of ways. Then we have resemblance constrained by class inclusion. We have the case of is-a-metaphors. There is a tendency, experimental psychologists say, to consider the term that we're talking about as having the property that distinguishes the class of items to which the other term belongs. So if we say that my lawyer is a shark, my lawyer is thought to belong to the class of predatory creatures, like a shark. But if we say my lawyer is like a shark, we destroy that. We are not saying that the lawyer is a predatory creature necessarily. It could be one of very many possible attributes. It could mean that my lawyer is very, very strong, or he's speedy, or if you look at his shape or the shape of his face, he looks like a shark. Experimental subjects, when confronted with a sentence like my lawyer is like a shark, with like, tend to produce many more properties than for my lawyer is a shark, where they think of the lawyer as being ruthless and predatory in nature. So we have to take into account class inclusion. We have class inclusion at work as a constraint on resemblance only in the case of metaphor, but not in the case of simile. Then we have similarity ratings. And there's also psycholinguistic work on this. So high similarity ratings are generally associated with metaphor, and low similarity ratings are associated with like similes. A sentence like her teeth are pearls is preferred to her teeth are like pearls because the experimental subjects feel that like pearls dissociates teeth and the pearls, and they have to. It looks strange because the teeth and the pearls, in our experience, look very similar. But when the similarity between the two terms of a metaphor or of a simile is not that clear, as for example, in her teeth are like the stars, then the preferred formulation has to use like. And yes, of course, you can always elaborate on this by making the grounds explicit, because it is not self-evident in what way the teeth can be like stars. Then it is possible to provide the grounds and say, well, her teeth are like the stars because they come out at night, or things like that. And that's a real sentence taken from a corpus search. And a sentence like her teeth are stars is dispreferred by experimental subjects because the teeth and the stars in a metaphorical formulation are so close to each other. And they are close, but they should not be close, because the similarity between teeth and stars is highly unclear. Now, we can take the three converging factors, class ascription, close-endedness or open-endedness, and similarity, whether low or high, and apply them to our general intuitions as speakers about what has to be metaphor and what has to be simile. We have a couple of examples on top of the screen. My lawyer is a shark is preferred to my lawyer is like a shark. Why? In terms of class description, the lawyer is a predator because the lawyer is ruthless like the predator. In terms of close-endedness, only one property is at work. There's other properties that sharks have, like physical strength or speed, or they have fins. You have also other behavioral and other physical, other material properties that you can think of. And then high similarity. There is high behavioral similarity because both the lawyer and the shark are dangerous in the same way. Simile is preferred when there is no class ascription, when there is open-endedness, and when there is low similarity. So for her teeth are like the stars, we have a preference for the simile. versus her teeth are the stars, which is dispreferred. There is a vague similarity between the teeth and the stars, and there are many properties that would be possible, and that calls for the use of like, and the similarity is, as I said, very, very low. So at least we have an instrument to predict potential native speaker judgments on the acceptability of formulations using metaphorical, the metaphorical expressions, or using simile of the like kind. Then let's talk about degrees of abstraction. I mentioned before the existence of low and high levels of resemblance. Low-level resemblance is very easy. In her teeth are pearls. We can see the shape of the teeth, the brightness of the teeth, the color of the teeth, and then the same features in the pearls. And that is what allows us to judge whether the teeth and the pearls belong together in metaphorical thought or in the form of simile. But then, what about the example, my job is a jail, that I gave before? And I said, well, this is very clearly a question of there is an attribute that is at work and there is similarity. But what I didn't say is how to spell out the type of similarity that we have here. The idea behind my job is a jail and metaphors like this is that there is a restriction of freedom in the job and in the jail. If for example, you're ill and you say, I feel like I'm in a jail, that I am in jail, it's because you suffer from restrictions when you're ill. You cannot enjoy life in the same way when you are confined to your home and in bed because of an illness. We could also say that coronavirus is also a jail, couldn't we? For the same reasons. Then take the other example at the bottom of the screen. Death is often treated metaphorically as a thief. And why? Here what we have is cause-effect similarity. Death takes away from us our most precious possession, which is life. So there is a similarity, which is a high-level one, between death as a thief and being robbed of your possessions. Then we have to think about metaphor and simile in terms of this distinction between high-level resemblance and low-level resemblance that was mentioned before. And I want to focus our attention on the case of correlation metaphor. Correlation metaphor has been always defined as a matter of co-occurrence of experiences. That's something that I said at the beginning of the talk. And the point is that the co-occurrence of experiences, like, for example, pouring water into a glass, so the level will go up and we create in our minds the connection between more and up, leads to something called conceptual conflation. Conceptual conflation is simply the mixing up in our minds of the two terms of the metaphor. So we think that more and up are the same thing. And that's why we talk freely about prices going up. And we're thinking of not of height, we're thinking of quantity, but our brains tend to believe that the two concepts are the same. Well, that's the idea in the work by Lakoff and Johnson, and also in other followers of this theory. But I would like to argue that it is not exactly like this. It is only like this to some extent. I would like to argue that there are two kinds of correlation metaphor. One is based on experiential correlation, as was noted before, that exploits, and I will point out that it exploits high-level resemblance. And the other one is based on effect-cause correlations. whereby the similarity of effects allows for the correlation of their corresponding causes. And this process underlies many metaphors and then some cases of a phenomenon called synesthesia. These are some correlation metaphors taken from Lakoff and Johnson's work. Think of, for example, the first one, affection is warmth. The experiential correlation behind this is that people feel warm when they are held by other people with affection. So the brain makes a connection between the affection, for example, of a hug and the feeling of warmth, physical temperature that is associated with the hug. For example, you can say that people are warm when they are friendly, and they are cold when they are unfriendly. Or take the second one, intimacy is closeness. When two people are intimate, that involves being close to one another. And that underlies expressions like they are really close friends or they're close to each other. Changes motion, as in she's going from bad to worse. That happens because we tend to correlate certain states with certain locations. We are cool in the shade. We are warm in bed. We are safe at home. Then take more is up. We saw before that levels rise and fall, as in prices are soaring. Wealth stocks have plummeted overnight. Similarity is closeness, as in these two colors are very close. Similar objects tend to cluster together in real life. For example, you see a flock of birds or a group of stars or a bunch of grapes. And finally, understanding is grasping, as in he was unable to grasp the idea, meaning to understand the idea. Because when you grasp an idea, when you touch it, you get to know about it. You derive information, and you understand the object that you are holding. So it is true that we have a correlation of experiences that allow for these metaphors to be created. But there is something else. There is also high-level similarity, high-level resemblance. For affection is warmth, what we have is similar feelings of comfort when receiving affection and when in a warm place. For intimacy is closeness, we have similar feelings of familiarity when being intimate with a person and when being very near a person. For change is motion, we have a similar feeling of being in a different condition when changing state and when changing locations. For more is up, we have the similar experience of increase when objects accumulate on when an object reaches a higher position. For similarity is closeness, we have a similar experience of spatial contiguity when comparing two objects and when two objects are close to each other. And for understanding is grasping, we have the similar experience of awareness when understanding the nature of an object or of a state of affairs and when touching the object. Then, as far as effect for cause connections, which is the other type of correlation metaphor, take immorality is filth. That's at the bottom of the screen. Immorality is filth is not based on similarity at the low level. So this is not like your teeth are pearls. There is no attribute of immorality that looks like an attribute of filth. In fact, filth and immorality, especially immorality, is a high-level concept. It's pretty abstract. Filth is more concrete. But the idea about filth in this metaphor is not the filth itself, but how we feel about it. The same as with immorality. So what we care about is not immorality and filth, but the effects of immorality on us and the effects of filth on us. For example, if we see a pig that is very dirty, it is filthy, we feel disgusted. We feel it is revolting. We can't suffer the stench of a pig. In the same way as when we are with an immoral person, we are disgusted. We have the feelings of disgust in a similar way as we have them when we are with a pig. And that's why we can say that people are pigs when they're immoral. Not only physically dirty, but when they are when they behave in an immoral way, when they treat other people badly, they are they are pigs, they are oppressive. And that's why we can say he's a dirty capitalist, for example. A person that hates capitalism would say he's a dirty, immoral capitalist, because I feel disgust when I'm with him. And but that's a correlation, and it is licensed, it is allowed to exist because of the similarity of effects. The causes are not similar, only the effects. Now, if you think about synesthesia, synesthesia has been traditionally described in terms of, well, it is applying an attribute that belongs to one domain to another domain where it doesn't really belong. So, for example, we can say that a noise is dull, for example, in the sentence, in the expression, a dull thud, but we should not be allowed to say that a color is dull, but people say it. And we say, oh, that was a dull red. It is not highly red, and it doesn't draw my attention. It is low in redness. It lacks intensity. Now, the thing is that, again, we have similarity of effects here. The similarity of effects is in terms of lacking intensity. When we are confronted with a dull sound, or when we are confronted with a dull color. So similarity of effects allows us to make a match between the different causes, which means that synesthesia is simply a metaphor that makes use of effect-cause correlations in sensory domains. This allows to rationalize the notion of synesthesia and bring it into a more general framework where synesthesia is clearly connected with metaphor. But of course, only if we understand that we can have high-level resemblance of this kind, based on effect-cause correlations, where similarity of effects allows us to make connections between the causes. Then we have the complex topic of structural resemblance, which is basically analogy. With a structural resemblance, we do not have specific properties or specific attributes of objects at work. What we have is connections, which are structural between different items in the following way. In the middle of the slide, you have how it works. The format of the reasoning process for analogy is A is to B as C is to D, or what C is to D. So A is C. A very clear example is thinking of the house as a pump. You will say, well, that's a metaphor. Yes, but that's not based on specific attributes, as in the case of the eyes are blue like the ocean, or the pearls are white as the teeth. What we have here is the heart is connected to the circulatory system in the same way as a pump is connected to a hydraulic system. So we can say that the heart is a pump. And we can say that the heart pumps blood throughout the body. You have an example here of the analogy. I hope it looks like, as in the case of a hydraulic system, it looks like a pump in a hydraulic system. Then we have another type of analogy-based metaphor, which is not based on low-level structural resemblance, but on high-level structural resemblance. This is a case of some metaphors. One of them is argument is war, where we have people that argue, and people that argue are contenders in a battle. The source domain is the contenders in a battle, the enemies. And the people that argue, that are temporarily contending, are envisaged, are seen as the contenders in a battle. And that happens because of the basic analogical form, at this high level that I mentioned before, between the people that argue and the contenders in a battle in the domain of arguing and in the domain of war, respectively. It is interesting to note that high-level structural resemblance only gives rise to metaphor, but not to simile. because simile requires, there is a tendency for simile to require visible, perceptually accessible attributes and relations. We can relate analogy to other figures of speech. One of them is paragon. And the example here is Tagore, the Indian writer, very famous, very well known. Some people would say that Tagore is the Shakespeare of India. Saying Tagore is like the Shakespeare of India would also work, but in general, it would be dispreferred versus Tagore is the Shakespeare of India. Again, we have a reasoning process which is analogical in form. Tagore, meaning his literary influence, which is a basic metonymy, is to Bengali literature in India as Shakespeare and his literary influence is to English or even to universal literature. So we can say that Tagore is the Shakespeare of India. Another example of paragon that I like is Humboldt is the Shakespeare of travelers. We think of Shakespeare as the ideal poetry writer with superior skills, and we think of Humboldt as the ideal traveler with superior skills in the domain of traveling. Shakespeare is the ideal writer in the domain of writing poetry. Humboldt is the ideal traveler in the domain of traveling. Shakespeare stands for Shakespeare's skills in writing poetry, and that maps onto Humboldt as a traveler in terms of a metaphorical mapping. And that's another case of paragon. And it follows the same type of analogical thinking that we have here, which is Shakespeare is to writing poetry as Humboldt is to traveling. And we can also make a connection between analogy and allegory. I don't know if you're familiar with Plato's allegory of the cave. We have a group of prisoners in the allegory that is chained in a cave facing a blank wall. They see shadows projected on the wall by objects in front of a fire behind them. And then one day, one of the prisoners escapes and sees reality, sees the actual objects, not the shadows that were projected on the wall. Then he comes back to the cave, and the rest of the prisoners, when he reports about how real life is, do not want to believe him. In this philosopher's allegory, the chained prisoners are common people, but the runaway prisoner is a philosopher. The philosopher finds greater knowledge when he gets out of the cave. And then he seeks to share the knowledge, but is resisted by the others that are less educated than the philosopher. Now, there is analogical thinking. Go to the bottom of the screen, and you will see that the runaway prisoner and the chained prisoners are the A element of the analogy, are to perceptual truth as the philosopher and common people are to ideal truth. So A is C. The runaway prisoner is the philosopher, the chained prisoners are common people, and B is D. Perceptual truth is ideal truth in the allegory. The interesting thing is that in allegory, we also have a metonymy, which is the metonymy, a member of a class for the whole class. That is necessary for the allegory to work. This is not only one philosopher, it refers to all of the philosophers. This is not one common person. It is everyone except for philosophers, of course. So common people in general. This summarizes the different types of resemblance and how they relate to low-level and high-level non-structural and structural metaphor and simile. You will see that when we have cases of low-level non-structural connections, what we produce is resemblance metaphor and also resemblance simile. Your eyes are like the ocean. If we combine the low-level and the high-level and the attribute-based or non-structural resemblance types, what we get is a correlation metaphor, like prices are going up, or immorality is filth, like my boss is a pig. If we combine the low-level resemblance type with the structural resemblance type, what we get is analogy, but this is low-level analogy. It is non-eventive. It is based on specific features of objects. Your nose is like an elephant's trump, or your nose is an elephant's trump. It would work also for the pump example that I gave before. The heart is a pump, or the heart is like a pump. And finally, argument is war would be described as a high-level, as using high-level structural resemblance, and it would be an analogy-based eventive metaphor, as in the sentences, arguments came under attack, or the two people that contend are enemies, they fight each other, and so on. By way of conclusion, resemblance is a more important factor in the understanding of metaphor than has been acknowledged so far. And to understand the meaning of metaphor and simile, we have to make reference to the types of resemblance relations that we have. High-level resemblance underlies correlation metaphor, which is based on experiential co-occurrence. Some cases of correlation metaphor are not based on experiential co-occurrence, but on similarities between effects that have different causes. And this similarity between effects allows us to make the connections, to relate the causes and make metaphorical connections. And finally, structural resemblance underlies analogy, and then other figures like paragon and allegory that are connected to analogy. These are some of the references, and thank you very much. I will end the slideshow, and come back to the main screen. It's over. Could you hear me well? I didn't check on that.
Yes, very well. Yes,
okay.
I did throughout the presentation. I hope everybody did as well. Francisco, thank you very much for a very enlightening and actually motivating lecture on metaphor and simile. As we always do, we are now open for questions. And Monica will be giving me the people who are already asking for a chance to ask you a question.
Okay.
Monica, are you there? We have João Paulo as the first person who would like to ask you a question. Okay, João. So you have a chance now to ask Professor Francisco Mendoza your question.
Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. First of all, I would like to congratulate Professor Francisco Mendoza for the presentation. It was great, and I've been reading lately about metaphors and metonyms, and especially the metaphors that were motivated by metonyms. And while he was sharing with us about some similes and some examples that uses this like particle, let's say, or word, I was thinking that what if we think that when we structure sentences like this, we are pointing some properties of the source domain. So I was thinking that are these similes maybe motivated by some metonymic relations in the source domain before they structure as similes? For example, when we say that A is like B, so we understand that we're not mapping the whole source domain, but we're mapping just some properties of the source domain, like the one that we say that the lawyer is like a shark. We're not mapping as a predator, but we're mapping maybe one aspect of the source domain. So, and we know that in metonyms we have one property that stands out actually out of the domain. So I was thinking that maybe the similes were previously motivated by metonyms before they structured themselves as similes. Would you agree with that? Does it make any sense?
I think that it would make sense, but in general, metonymies, what they do is they elaborate on some aspects of a metaphorical source or a metaphorical target. For example, I'm thinking of the sentence, "She won my heart," meaning that she made me fall in love with her. So what she won was not my physical heart, of course, was the emotions, the feelings, the love feelings that are associated with my heart. And that's a metonymic elaboration of the target domain of the metaphor. Or we can think of other cases where what we have is a development of the source domain. I give you an example of that with Humboldt and Shakespeare, where we have a metonymic elaboration of Shakespeare, where we focus on some aspects of Shakespeare, and those are the ones that we transfer or that are projected in some sort of way to the target domain. In that case, it was the traveler, Humboldt, the traveler. So I would say that in general, what we have is metonymy as being subsidiary to metaphor, rather than metonymy giving rise to metaphor. Now, there is a counter-argument against what I'm saying. The counter-argument is that because we have experiential conflation, we have correlation of experiences that gives rise to conflation in the mind, experience-based conflation, and we mix up concepts. They belong together, they're one single domain. So for example, when you say more is up, why not say that that is a metonymy and say that more stands for up? And when I say prices go up or go down, what I mean is, okay, up stands for greater quantity, so prices are increasing. The counter-argument against this idea is that with metaphor we always have some sort of reasoning system, and we do not have that for metonymy. With metonymy, what we have is a perspective. We think of the target in terms of the source, and we have a conceptual shortcut. And when we say more is up, we are actually reasoning about in what way more is up. And we can say that prices go up, but we can also say prices are soaring, or they're going up very high, or they're skyrocketing. So we think in what way prices are moving up. And that is what is mapped onto the target idea of increase. And now with respect to simile, because simile is different from metaphor, we might think, what if simile is motivated in some way by metonymy? But remember that the reason why I don't think it is possible, and I think that what we have in the cases of simile, and that's the examples that I gave, is also elaboration of source and target, rather than something preliminary to the creation of the simile. What we had, remember, is open-endedness, class inclusion, and then the closeness of the similarity, licensing the creation of metaphor versus simile. Or if we have full open-endedness and we have low similarity, we're going to have simile. So we already have this game between the source and target domains. We have them, both of them, at work, already activated, and then any metonymic elaboration depends on this previous activation of the source and the target. But metonymy is very important. It builds into metaphor, into the source of the target, and the same, I guess, the same happens in the case of simile, that it builds up into either the source or the target, developing some aspects of it, but not reasoning about them. That's metaphor or simile, only putting them into the right perspective for the metaphorical connection to be worked out. Does it make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, it does. Yeah, thank you for the answer. And I was really glad that you mentioned the conflation experience, let's say, into metonymy, because that's one of the things I was reading about metonymic-based metaphors. For example, when we have more is up, and up would be like up for more, and affection is warmth, and warmth for affection, because we can dissociate both, let's say, sub-themes when we experience them, and that would affect the correlational metaphors. And then we would say that all correlational metaphors, they would be potentially metonymic based, but you're right. I mean, I'm glad you said it. It's about perspective too, because that makes the whole difference between, let's say, metaphors and metonyms. So, because that would be my next question. So, thank you very much for that.
If you think about affection is warmth and other conflation metaphors, when you say that a person is warm or cold, you're reasoning about it. You're reasoning about how you feel with a person. So it's not simply saying, oh, if this stands, A stands for B. No, he's warmer than I am. He's colder than I am. He's really cold to me and really mean to me. So we are thinking about one item in terms of the other. We're not simply a simple, straightforward connection between the two items. We have a full reasoning system behind them. And that's why. I would say goals are destinations. Goals or destinations underlies the famous love is a journey metaphor. And we have lovers connected to travelers. That's not a stands for connection. The love relationship is a vehicle, and the impediments to motion maps onto difficulties in the relationship. And I can say something like, oh, we are lost in this relationship. Maybe we should try to find our ways out, or we may have to retrace our steps. What if we go back to the starting point? We are reasoning about the different items. We are reasoning about the love relationship. We're not simply making simple connections as we have in the case of metonymy. Yes. So I think it is a misled assumption that some scholars have made that we have instead of goals or destinations, yes, the destination stands for the goal and things like that. It doesn't really make sense because of the reasoning, the complex reasoning system that we can have, and the same for the others.
Thank you very much.
Okay, John, did this answer your question?
Keep making questions, so then the other guys won't have the chance to ask either. So, but thank you very much for the answer. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah.
We also have another person who would like to ask you a question, Augusto de Castro. It's your turn now, Augusto. Augusto? Are you there? Apparently, he's not there anymore.
Well, maybe he was running late or something.
Yes. Send him a quick chat here.
Augusto is here. He says, I'm here.
Okay.
So maybe he can type in his question if his microphone doesn't work.
Augusto?
He could use the chat.
Yes. Okay. I'll ask him to do so.
He's probably writing the question.
All right. Probably. We just have to be patient. I was just wondering, Francisco.
What is the relationship of classical rhetoric?
Okay. What's the relationships of classical rhetoric, and there must be a conclusion to this question. Or what is the relation to classical rhetoric? Maybe.
And
music, rhetorical figures. Yes.
What is understood by musical rhetorical figures? Because I don't know much about music.
Yes.
So if
he has to be more specific.
It's referring to alliteration and things like that. When you repeat the same vowel or the same consonant over and over again to create an effect, is that it? Okay. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
You have to be. Yeah. So if I'm right about the nature of the question, the answer is that there is no connection between investigation in figurative language and alliteration and phenomena like that are also studied in rhetoric, and especially more than in rhetoric, in literary theory, because poets use those resources a lot. Those are not figures of thought or figures of speech, but they are resources that poets and writers use to convey some extra meaning associations, but they do not handle conceptual domains in connection to one another very clearly. They evoke meaning connections in much the same way as when I look at a person, it may evoke the idea that I am interested in that person. Or if, for example, I smile, it may invoke the idea that I'm happy. If I have a sad face, the idea is that I feel gloomy and sad, and so on. So there are subjective emotional connotations that are called upon by formal resources. And there is no conceptual makeup and connections as we have in the case of metaphor and metonymy. It's simply a different set of devices that poets can use, or writers in general can use, to endow their writing with more meaning.
Okay, now I think my mic is on. I got the idea of what you just meant. May I just add some extra info?
Yeah.
Okay. In rhetorical figures of a musical language from Baroque era, for example, we have something called metonymy also, and that is a theory that evolved pretty well in German, actually, back in the 70th and 18th century music, right? And from the point of view of linguistics and language, this can be expressed exactly how you just mentioned, right? The ideas of enhancing meaning and conveying meanings, just like you just present to us in this figures of language in English, for example. And what my problem here is that how can I dwell even deeper in this relationship of what is so-called the language figures of spoken language itself, with these ideas of the musical rhetorical language, what they called musica poetica, for example, the musical rhetorical figures from German Baroque music. And the idea is like somehow there are concepts that are alike, but of course when the matter is music, right? And then you have notes, and you have ascending notes and descending notes and jumps.
Yes,
and
that's iconic.
This reverse things and things that are like simile or alike, right?
Yeah.
So I just wonder, because I'm getting into this research now of studying the cello Bach suites, and I got a degree in language, right? And I'm mixing this stuff,
Yep.
And it is possible, actually. I just would like to know your thoughts about that.
Because I don't know much about music, I don't think I can fully answer your question. But I have a former doctoral student whose name is Paula Perez Sobrino, and she has written a few papers because she knows a lot of music. She has written a few papers on the connections between metaphor, symbolic meaning in general, metaphor, iconicity, and music. So I could refer you to her work. I could send Professor Pelosi or Professor Carneiro a couple of her papers that deal with the topic. And in fact, what she did is to partly use some of my theories on metaphor and metonymy to give the theoretical, to elaborate the theoretical framework of her work. And she was very successful because the papers were published in very prestigious journals. So Probably she knows better. She would be able to answer your question better. But it is true that there is iconicity. Iconicity is everywhere in our lives. It is form resembles meaning, right? And if music conveys, and you want to convey meaning through music, rising and falling is like opening up or closing. Rising is like in intonation, rising intonation, falling intonation. When you ask a yes/no question in English, you have rising intonation because you're open to a yes/no answer. But there is falling intonation when you have a final thought. For example, in an imperative, you say, come here. You don't say, come here. No, that would be a question. You need an answer. You're opening up. And that's iconic. In the same way you have that in music. So it's a very interesting field. And I'm so sorry that I cannot elaborate on it a lot more.
No, that's all right. I mean, you gave just a brilliant lecture for us all, and I'm glad I could hear your words. And actually, if you actually if you can send those links to Professor Monica, I would be very glad to get that back later on. I talk to her. I would be really interested in that. And this thing you just mentioned about the intonation, this is how it goes in music. I mean, you have the compositional aspects exactly aim to communicate. Is that a question? I mean, musically, is that an answer? And all these ideas, like the motifs, the fugue-like motifs.
We also have compression of notes, too many notes in little space. And that's also iconic, right? And then we have some
the clusters.
Yes. So there is iconicity. I'm sure of that. Iconicity is an extreme form of resemblance. So if there is iconicity, there is resemblance, and there may be.
That's really interesting.
Remember, the resemblance comes in degrees, and the extreme case of resemblance is called iconicity. It's simply an extreme form of resemblance.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Yep.
Yeah, this is what I was looking for. Like what is that gears the sort of likeness between one phrase and another, and of course in linguistics all those theories has been studied and evolved, and there is some literature about music rhetorical figures and something they call the theory of affection. So you have the tonality of the sound, and that represents like a colorful mood or a happy mood or some more, let's say a sad vibe, for example. And then you have ways to putting that together. And the musical rhetorical figures sort of are the sort of the rice and bread of how the music is written. That's just, I think it was very enlightening, your explanation. I'm going to read more about the iconicity and this kind of things. Thank you very much, Professor.
You're welcome, Augusto.
Okay, we now have Ricardo Santana. Ricardo, would you like to voice your question? Because you have already written it down, but you could, speak it out. Ricardo?
I can't see it. What do I have to do?
He wrote in the chat.
Okay, I see. Metaphors.
Okay, but Ricardo says that the person who's asking is actually Simone. Okay, Simone, could you go ahead and ask your question?
But is the question, would correlation metaphors based on high similarity?
That's right. That's right, yes. Okay, she wants just to use the chat. Yes, this is the question. Would correlation metaphors based on high similarity be called structural metaphors?
They're not. Go to this slide. I don't know if you can see the slide now. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So if you think about the connections that are laid out here, when you have a structural connection, when you have structural similarity and high level, what you have is something like his arguments came under attack, which is an analogy-based metaphor. So there is analogy. It is not something like a structural it's a structural metaphor, but it's different from the heart pump connection. It is a different type. That's low level. So the answer would be a qualified yes. It would be yes. It is an analogy-based metaphor, but it is based on the description of an event, not the description of an object. Yes, because that would be the low level one. So the answer is a qualified yes in terms of this diagram. Correlation metaphors based on high similarity. Well, metaphors are always based on high similarity. If you have low similarity, the preference is for simile. Similarity has not been introduced here because these are similarity simply leads you to choose metaphor from simile, or if you have low similarity, you choose simile, but that has nothing to do with the low level, high level, structural, non-structural connections. So it wouldn't really matter. If you have high similarity between source and target, you can still have this classification at work. So similarity is simply something, it is simply a factor or a criterion that allows you to choose between metaphor and simile, that's all. So they can be structural metaphors based on high similarity, and you can have structural metaphors based on low similarity, and they would not work well, and probably people would choose an expression with like. Yes, if you have the heart pump connection, that there is high similarity, but maybe there is less similarity in the connection between my finger, if you can look at it, and this pen. And we could have this and a background domain, and the background domain for the finger is my hand, and unless you find a good background domain for this, the similarity would be low and the analogy would be a poor one. I don't know if you can see this or not on the screen, but this connection between this box and the hand would be a very poor one, because that's very low similarity, and it would call for an expression with like. The pen is like the finger in terms of the hand domain and in terms of the box domain. And that's as far as I can go with this. So similarity only tells you that you have to choose like or a metaphor. Yes, but nothing else. It does not affect the classification that I offered here.
Okay, does anybody else have a question for Professor Mendoza?
Okay, he says okay.
Can I ask you a question? Actually,
Yes,
it's more a comment I have. Yep. When you were talking about people are pigs, and you were saying that they're it's not only because of being dirty, but when you say people are pigs, you mean they are oppressive, they are immoral, and I couldn't help thinking about the different levels of meaning emergence which are involved in this.
Yeah.
Because the most straightforward analogy would be, okay, they're pigs, they're dirty. But when we think about immorality, being oppressive, we cannot help but thinking of social cultural situated aspects. Yes. In the construction of this analogy, of this simile, or actually, it's actually a metaphor. People are pigs. You're not saying that like pigs, they're pigs. What would you say about that, Francisco?
The true analysis about people are pigs from a conceptual perspective is more complex than I laid out. So what you have is people are animals, which is a highly conventional metaphor. What we have is animal behavior, and sometimes physical attributes too, but mostly animal behavior, mapping onto human behavior. Right. And then, because immorality is a type of behavior, or immorality, it is a character trait, but at the same time, there is an effect. If you are an immoral person, you will do immoral things. and the effects are visible. Then you have immorality is filth because of the effects connection between filth and morality. And then immorality is filth is built into people or animals. Immoral people are filthy animals. When you talk about immorality is filth, you think of pigs, but you don't think of a duck. You don't think of a goose. You don't think of a hen. You think of a very dirty animal like pigs.
Yeah.
And the connection, the reason why you can build immorality is filth into people or animals is that you have a licensing factor, which is the effect-cause connection. And you could argue that, in fact, that is a metonymy, effect for cause. The effect stands for the cause, and that allows you to bring together immorality is filthiness and build it into people or animals. So we have three factors at least at work. We have three mappings. People are animals, immorality is filth, and then what allows you to bring immorality is filth into people or animals? Effects for causes.
Yes, that actually.
And when you think of immoral people in terms of effect cause, all the cultural aspects come into the picture. There is a selection of attributes in the basic mapping, but that has to be enriched with cultural factors. And they come in fully fledged when you have created the connection between immorality is filth, people are animals, licensed by effect for cause. Once you have everything there, the two packages of thinking, the two domains, which are very complex, culture is there enriching everything and allowing the two aspects to be placed in richer forms of connections. So
that is very good. That is a very good answer to my comment. It was actually a question. It was more of a comment. Yes.
The skeleton is first, and then you put flesh into the skeleton.
Yeah, that's great. That's great, and that is why I would dare to say sometimes an analogy that works very well in a certain culture might not be so effective in another one.
Yeah,
because
analogies can be very poor, and sometimes they don't work. And when you read examples of analysis that people try to give, and if they're not very skillful at creating analogies, sometimes the analogies are almost nonsensical. And you say, okay, and they have to elaborate on them and then explain them because nobody understands how they work.
True.
But
yes.
that's because the similarity is low.
Yeah.
And that's why when people say, well, that's like, and they use like, it's like saying, okay, I understand that the similarity is not very, is not close. There is low similarity. So let me explain, let me elaborate on this. And they use
let's use a like.
And like dissociate. It's like, I acknowledge that I was wrong in creating the analogy, so I have to explain it. I will use like. I cannot use dramatic, which is a compressed form.
Yes. One of my previous doctorate students, she developed a thesis on the use of cabra, which is a regional term for a valiant, courageous male figure. And she went through, all the evidence provided by
does cabra
dictionaries.
Mean
sorry?
Does cabra mean goat?
Goat, yes. Sorry?
Is it because goats are aggressive?
Could be, and resilient. They can survive into very drastic weather conditions. In the northeast of Brazil. So she gathered evidence from dictionaries, from regional dictionaries, and also she applied a kind of psychological instrument in which people would have to say what's the first thing that comes to their mind when they hear the expression. And it was a very interesting work. So that's it, because here in the northeast of Brazil, when we say, oh, he is cabra bom, or he is cabra valente, that all has to do with a male figure who is resilient, who is, daring, who is courageous, and so on and so forth. Can be violent as well.
there is a rule for that. The target domain of a mapping always tells you what you have to find in the source. So because
All right.
about the type of person, then
Sure.
you look for something that resembles the type of person.
Yes.
That is
Yes. And
recipient.
one of her departure points was actually the metaphor, people are animals. So she departed from there. Yes.
Mhm.
And then she could build on, you know, this analogy to create a thesis as regards the use of the expression cabra. Okay. I suppose that was actually the last intervention, Francisco.
Okay.
It's rather late in Spain now, isn't it?
Yes, yes. It's 10:30 at night.
10:30. Okay. Yes. So yeah, it's time to yeah, to maybe think about having a rest now. But thank you very, very much for your participation today. It was a great pleasure for all of us to have you. It was a very didactic. You know, you could present a complex subject in a very didactical way. That is very, very good. That was very, very good and appreciated. Thank you very much. And you will be
privilege for me.
You will be receiving.
Yes, I feel very grateful, and it was a privilege for me. So thank you for
inviting me very much
to this online talk, and also for all the people attending, and for the nice questions they asked and the interest they invested in my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will be inviting, you know, all the participants to the future, to the other lectures. So you'll be receiving some emails from us in due course. Okay? And a certificate at the end. Everybody will have a certificate. Okay, thank you very much, Francisco. Have a nice evening, and
Ana?
See you. Okay, Monica, you want to say something?
No, just to let you know that Professor Mark Turner was attending the conference.
I noticed. Yes.
Oh,
yes.
you did?
I was going. Yes. I was going to mention that, but then I could not at that point. But I noticed that Mark Turner was here with us, and right now, near the end of the talk, I also noticed that Elena, our colleague from Lancaster University, also went into the room. Yes.
Yeah. Luciane.
Yes, Luciane is here. Mara was here.
Mara
but had to leave because of meeting. Yes.
It was very nice.
Several people from CIGELP as well.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to thank Professor Mendoza for your conference. It was brilliant.
Else, you'd like to add?
Yeah, just to thank him for the brilliant conference, and we'll have a chance later on to plan something, another conference. You can start planning because I'm sure there are things for next year. And we also have the conference, the metaphor conference next year. Yes. So we'll be talking about this later on. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks to all of you.
We're saying goodbye now. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.